What's up, YouTube? So today we're doing a full track walkthrough of my track Big Bang, which just launched on my new album, Augmented Reality. So all the details to that album will be available in the details. I'm sure most of you are just here for the production stuff. So let's dive in and have a look. Okay, so firstly I want to talk about some kind of like overall stuff that you'll probably notice throughout quite a few of the tracks on my album, if we do end up going through walkthroughs of those, in fact, is the sheer volume of sounds that don't make it into the final project. And this is something that I kind of wanted to stress. Is I see a lot of people saying like, oh, you make it look so easy and all these types of things, but like it's not as easy as we make it look. Obviously we've got the power of editing and all these types of things, so I'm sorry if I make it look easier than it actually is and all that kind of stuff, but it's not. You know, we also go through a lot of kind of work in the process of creating what we think is like our perfect track or whatever the case is. So here I can actually show all of the deactivated tracks, and even here this is kind of stuff that either didn't make it into the project, or it was kind of like work in progress sounds, or with stuff that was then kind of rendered to audio samples and then dragged into the project. I like to keep a lot of these kinds of things in case I ever want to dive in here and kind of see how did I make the sound, or you know, there's always kind of like a backup process and I can just hide it, you know, out of sight, out of mind, which is really, really cool. So I've also got a bunch of stuff you'll notice like in each of the groups. I like to keep my projects very kind of methodically grouped and that kind of thing, not only for processing, but also just for, you know, later diving in and seeing like what all is going on here. It's a lot easier when you keep things quite neatly organized within groups and all sorts of stuff like that. It feels like there's almost more channels here that aren't in the project than there are ones that are in the project, which is pretty funny. I like to say that, like, you know, music production is like so much of what you take out is the important part. You know, we can kind of make sounds till we blue in the face, but the groove is like the stuff between that. It's like what we don't have. And then you kind of like fill in the gaps. I don't know if I'm even making sense. Anyway, this track actually started quite a while ago. I actually started this track, or the concept of this track, in Cubase. And it was at that stage still basic kind of like ideas. I think there was just kind of 2 or 3 samples that ended up making it from that original project into this final project. I think it was just this pad and this chant and this ARP thing. I believe all of the other sounds I ended up like remaking, and actually these vital mains, these synth sounds. And I think 1 or 2 of the vocal, time and space, that vocal sound as well. Everything else I ended up redoing and recreating because like there was just, I guess this happens a lot with my tracks, where it'll be in the kind of really early idea stages for a very long time. Just be kind of like ideas and sounds. At one point, suddenly a kind of vision will come together. And then suddenly all those sounds will kind of like come together to form like the piece, you know what I mean? While it was still in Cubase, it was very much still idea stages. I'm sure some of you who've been following the channel for a while maybe even remember those streams where we started creating the track. However, it's kind of progressed a lot from there. It's just a couple of those samples. In fact, I'll show you the intro. It was basically just that kind of intro that I was working on, and then I ended up rendering those samples out, throwing it into this project. So this kick is from the Camphor Audio Psytrance Kick Pack Volume 1, if I'm not mistaken. It's the Cairo D sharp, and the track is in D sharp. So I decided to start with a kind of more offbeat, progressive style bass line. The idea here was to kind of like slowly move from a kind of more progressive sound into the more kind of full-on sound. And you'll notice there's this kind of transition that happens around about here, where it's within this track which kind of transitions from a more progressive to a kind of more traditional full-on sound, both in the rolling bass but also the sounds that are present. So here in the beginning, it's this kind of like very progressive kind of sound. There's some chants. For those who don't know, I actually released a progressive album not so long ago, which was kind of more chilled psytrance stuff with a lot of these kinds of more offbeat basses, chants, and that kind of thing. I guess this was a bit of a throwback to that kind of sound and a moving into a new sound, if you know what I mean. So the progression of the bass was pretty simple. It was just these kind of like longer bass notes like this, right? And then here we had this kind of like roll, which is just a render of 32 basses. Boom, 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 boom. So it's just like I rendered out one sample, duplicated it a bunch of times to create that kind of like grind effect. Let's talk about the sound design of the bass sound here. This is something that you'll probably notice throughout the album. If I do go through the other kind of tracks in walkthroughs and stuff, let me know in the comments if you do want that kind of thing. Is that I've done a kind of a split. So the fundamental frequency, the lowest sine wave within the bass sound, is in its own channel over here. And all of the other upper harmonics are in a separate channel or being synthesized in its own kind of like oscillator. And the reason I've done that is not really for processing sake, but more for the envelope. So often I find, you know, when you finish with a track and you start processing it, mixing it and mastering it, I often find that the lowest sub frequency of the bass tends to kind of blow out and sound too chunky. And so I had this idea to kind of split that fundamental, not in terms of like being able to process it separately, but more just being able to like change the envelope, you know, make the envelope shorter than the rest of the sound. So you may or may not notice this on the speakers that you're listening, especially if you're on like a laptop or something like that. But if you're on good headphones, you'll definitely notice the difference with this in like on and off. But here, if we just hone into just the sub frequencies, can you hear that? It's like, it's still got that kind of like punchy nature, as opposed to like with the mids and the upper frequencies, they're a lot more legato. Do you know what I mean? And so I find that if they're both at the same envelope, like the low frequencies and the mids, they often kind of blow out in the mix on the master. They kind of sound a bit too muddy. Being able to split them, I was able to kind of exactly tune the amount of decay that I want for the sound down to the millisecond, you know? And so just found that just made the bass sound so much cleaner. And so I think the reason that I split these patches here, there's two separate patches, is because with this one, because it's now a rolling bass as opposed to that longer legato bass, I had to actually change the decay shorter for the sub frequency, because now I want it even punchier for this bass sound. Do you know what I mean? And these kinds of things are like so subtle. Do you know what I mean? Most people don't hear them on laptop speakers or cell phones or whatever the case is. But on a festival system and on like good quality speakers, truly audible. So just for argument's sake, what I'll do is I'll set the sustain of this up to somewhere close to what this sustain is, in 97%. And now let's listen to the example. Do you hear that? It's subtle, but it makes a difference. That's the kick in the bass, pretty much. Okay, so here there's this transition which goes into the kind of more traditional full-on sound that's signified by both a kind of more rolling bass sound as well as kind of more psychedelic lead sounds. Another thing that I actually want to speak about in the bass is the processing, for example, sidechain. So here I've got just a bunch of stuff like multiband processing, with a bit of harsh in the mid-range, just doing some stuff like that. Very subtle stuff. And then some compression. And here we've got the sidechain. So I've done something here with Snap Heap where I basically created LFO tool, but using Snap Heap. The interesting thing here is that I've used an LFO table and not a traditional LFO. So what this allows us to do is actually just sweep that shape with just one knob. You know, it makes the kind of setup of this kind of thing just super easy, because I'm often just using this kind of shape with Psytrance, and it's just about the volume of that first of the three notes. Does that make sense? And so rather than having to open the LFO and change each point and everything, just that one knob, it's just so easy to like drop in there, adjust to taste, move on to the next sound, you know? I guess that's the other thing, is like try not to be too meticulous about these things. You can kind of sit and stress about phase for like the rest of your life, but focus on like creating the track. And like if something arises where it's like, okay, this bass just sounds a little bit too muddy, then you think, what can I do in terms of the frequency splits and that kind of thing to kind of reduce that? There's no essentials, there's no kind of silver bullets to making a perfect track, you know? That's definitely something that I want to stress. Here with the EQ on the bass, you can see there's very, very subtle changes, nothing too drastic happening. I guess these were just more for taste, for tonal kind of processing of the bass sound. Say, for example, there were certain frequencies which were just poking out a little bit too harshly on the bass. We can actually just hear what it sounds like with that on and off. Such subtle stuff. And same thing with the compression. We're just kind of like hitting that top peak of the compression. Here with this, I use FurComp 2, which is really, really cool because it allows us to quickly switch the delta listen. What that does is that allows you to hear the sounds which are being removed by the compressor. So it's a nice way of being able to quickly tell, like, are you destroying the sound? Because now if I switch to delta listen and there's something nice there that I like, then I'll often tend to dial back the compression. But you hear that, it's just a bit of that kind of like floopiness. I don't know even know if that's a word, but it's that kind of like that looseness to the bass, which is actually being removed from the compression. So AB without and with. There's actually two EQs happening on this channel. I think one was just before the compression because I wanted to change the reaction of, you know, how the compressor reacts. Say, for example, you have certain frequencies which are kind of hitting the threshold of a compressor too hard, and that kind of changes the overall dynamics of the compressor itself. And so I often use an EQ before the compressor to alter like how the sound is hitting that threshold of the compressor. Does that make sense? So in fact, what we can do to actually outline this even further, let's go on to the and apply this delta listen. I just explained what that does. Now we can actually A/B what this EQ is doing to that threshold. Does that make sense? With the EQ off, to me it felt like the compressor was now removing too much of the good sound. You know what I mean? And so what I did is I used the EQ to kind of like tell the compressor what sounds to hit the threshold harder on, you know, what frequency range to hit the threshold harder on. And that's a super powerful technique. Even though it's just kind of really, really subtle, it really helps the overall mix. Okay, so the percussion is relatively simple. I'm not going to dive too much into the progression and that kind of thing. With Psytrance, there's generally a hi-hat on the and a clap or snare on the 2 and 4. So I'm not going to dial too much into like the placement, but there's something interesting about how I kind of group all of this stuff together. I generally have main percussions in a single group, and this will just be like the main open hi-hat, the main snare or clap, and a crash. Everything else in terms of the percussions will be in other groups, and the reason I do this is to be able to kind of like dial them back a little bit easier, sidechain them a little bit harder than the main percussions. Obviously, you don't want to sidechain the main percussions too hard, because then you might lose a bit of that snare. Do you know what I mean? But if it's like other snares in the background, or kind of like fills and kind of like other stuff, percussion loops and that kind of thing, you can kind of actually help the main snare and the main hi-hat stick out by processing the other ones a little bit harder with like side chains, clipping them a little bit to let the main percussions actually pop through in the mix. And so I generally end up splitting them into 2 or 3 groups where it'll be main percussions and then other stuff, you know? And you'll see that the other stuff is generally processed with like a dynamics, and this actually grabs the sidechain from the kick. So you'll see this quite often in this project and other projects that I do, this dynamics. And this is basically kind of like my overall mix sidechain. So generally I have like the sidechain with the bass, which is that kind of really programmed square sidechain. Then I'll have like a really subtle mix sidechain. And that's on stuff like aux perks, background synths, sound effects, and the kind of stuff that you really don't need to pop out in the mix. And what this allows you to do is, for example, send the kick to this, and then it ducks this channel out to allow the kick to punch through. Specifically with louder masters, you can really hear the difference with subtle sidechain on kind of like group channels that aren't so important in the overall mix. Often with the background stuff, specifically with percussions, when you've got a very busy section like this, often the percussions can sometimes get a little bit lost in the mix. So it can help to, say, for example, clip something like your percussions just to make the overall group sound louder. What happens when you do that is that the top peaks of this percussion group will be shaved off. But let's say, for example, like I said, I'm not going to be clipping the main percussions as hard. I am subtly, but not as hard. What that allows us to do is basically shave the peaks off the aux perks, and then the peaks of the main perks are going to poke through a little bit more, while the peak of the kick is really out the top of the mix. Does that make sense? So using this kind of like group clipping method, you can kind of like control your dynamics almost from the ground up. You're saying like, I only want this amount of dynamics for this group. I want this amount of dynamics for this group, and then kick and bass, maximum dynamics. Does that make sense? Okay, so kick, bass, percussions, all of that kind of stuff, I generally group into an overall, I call it the transition group or the KBP, kick, bass, percussion. What this allows me to do is quickly throw effects like snap heap or filters and that kind of thing, which I use for transitions. Let me see if there's anything in the track which... So using this transitions macro, by the way, this preset is from my Catalyst Snap Heap pack, which is basically a bunch of these kind of transitions and other interesting effects. So it's essentially one knob that does the entire transition, and we can automate this.
Able to break the laws of time and space.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about are these reverbs. So sometimes I'll have them in individual tracks, like sometimes I'll have like a transition delay, sometimes I'll have like a room reverb specifically for percussions. Okay, I don't have any in this case, but you know, I'll often have them like in the percussions and stuff like this. But then I'll often also have kind of like overall mix reverbs. And in this instance, I often use the Valhalla Supermassive. I'll generally have 3 instances as send effects. And so each one has a slightly different EQ before and after, and then they each go into that same sidechain that I was talking about. And so what this allows you to do is, you know, add a send reverb onto a sound, but it's never going to clash with the main kick in the project because it's always going to be slightly sidechained subtly in and out. And so, you know, just setting it up like this while you're doing the mix just helps to quickly throw sounds into a reverb and not having to worry too much about it clashing later down the line. And so you'll notice like often there'll be just a little bit of reverbs here added here and there on some of these things like this, for example. And so it's more just like a creative thing. I try not to think about like getting too nitty gritty about processing individual sounds when I'm looking at the mix, because I'm trying to look at it, I guess, from a kind of a bigger picture perspective. Do you know what I mean? Because often each of the sounds will have their own kind of granular sounds and processing and stuff bounced in there already. Sometimes I just need to add a little bit of extra sizzle here and there. And basically that's what those reverbs are for. So they'll have individual settings in Valhalla Supermassive for different sized reverbs and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's that. And the rest is basically like the leads, Atmos, and sound effects. I guess the sound effects are, it's pretty simple stuff. It's often just like a kick with a reverb on it, a vocal sample, some of the other stuff from the project with some processing on it, some uplifters from sample packs, hi-hats that have been reversed. You know, it's this kind of, I guess this is more just like everything else from the project. There's drum fills, glitchy sounds, all sorts of stuff here. But this is like, I guess it's harder to dive into and show you individually like how to create each sound, because often this kind of stuff is just kind of thrown in from a a mud pie or a sample pack or a cherry pie or recorded in from a random thing on a hardware or something like that. So I guess this whole folder here, sound effects, is a lot more random, and it's just kind of thrown in there and stuff is removed to taste. I guess the more methodical and programmed sound design stuff and leads and stuff happens in the synths folder. Okay, I'm going to quickly discuss some of these more kind of sound effects and Atmos type stuff. Then we're going to get into the main leads. So this stuff, I guess, is like this Vital mains. This was taken from the original idea of the project, still in the Cubase days. This is a pretty simple lead. I think it's just like a saw wave with some filter with high resonance and some distortion, and then some reverb and delay. But this is, as you can see here, the function of the sound was more as like a transition from one bar into the next bar. So you can see it's kind of used throughout in the project, but it's still not like a main lead. You know, you don't notice, like when you listen to it, it's not like, I remember this from the project. So I guess it's more of like a background transition style lead. A lot of this kind of synth effects, Atmos type stuff, I kind of, how can I say, when I'm producing the tracks, I don't have the final picture in mind. I'll just be throwing a lot of ideas at the wall, and it'll be like, okay, this sound is not so stand out, like main leadish, you know what I mean? So it then becomes the background sound, and the leads that are more standout-ish become the main leads, you know? So the next big thing in the project is this kind of like Hive stack. This is essentially just a big chord that I recorded through a couple of different pad presets in Hive, and then just process them differently. As you can see, I think this one is a long delay, this one is a reverb, this one is reversed. So it's the same sound, just run through several different processes in different contexts. Some is reversed, some is forward, but it's, you know, the same kind of tone overall. In fact, we can actually just highlight these and solo them, so I can just show you a quick reference of what I'm talking about. It's all that kind of stuff, you know, and I generally leave that, or I render that down to audio because it's easier to work with. You know, you can reverse it, you can chop it at the end of the bar, and you can do that kind of stuff as you need. Whereas if you're working with it, say, for example, in a granular synth or something like that, there'll be a little bit of release, and maybe it'll kind of like bleed into the next bar and that kind of thing. So with these more kind of atmospheric stuff, it can definitely help to work with audio files. As you can see, you can kind of reverse them, chop them exactly at where the bar starts or before. That's another thing that I really like to do, is to kind of build up and build up and build up, just almost silence, maybe just one atmospheric sound in the background, then drop the beat, because that little moment of silence will make that first drop so much louder and so much more present, because there's that kind of moment of tension in the silence. This is the beginning of the track. I'll just show you what I'm talking about here. So often these first few bars, like these synth sounds and stuff that you'll hear in my tracks, often these first few bars are bits of other sounds in the track that have been processed and reversed and stretched and all sorts of things, because it kind of like gives you a hint of the sounds that are going to come a little bit later. Like, for example, here there's just this one little sequence of plucks from Vital, then there's this sound here. But I mean, these all then come in later as more prominent parts of the overall arrangement. So it's just little hints of the sounds that are going to come later on in the mix. Sometimes I'll use Foley sounds and other interesting things to kind of keep the interest going. Sometimes I feel like, you know, with a lot of tracks, the first few bars can maybe be a little bit underwhelming. So it can help to keep the interest going there, specifically with, you know, sound designy type stuff, before too much of the main groove and melodic stuff starts to fill up that space, you know? I think this actually came from the original project as well, but it was definitely done with Fuzzion, which is a fantastic plugin for this kind of 303 type sound. Then it's obviously got a little bit of distortion on it, and then you can see here in this part, it kind of fades into a part where the feedback and mix of a delay is kind of like mixed further and further in to create that transition.
Time and space.
So this was like the beginning of the kind of like full-on section of the track. It kind of like builds up to that drop where the bass goes full. And so I really wanted to go, you know, kind of create something that sounded almost Goa, old school full-on-ish. So I created this lead here, but as you can see, there's kind of a few variations of it in the drop. So I'll discuss how those were made, but what we can do is we can actually just enable this track and we can actually jump in here and actually see how this preset was made. You can see it's a very simple preset. It's just saw wave, 2 band pass filters with some modulation on the filters, some distortion, and some chorus. And I wanted to create that kind of random, because the modulations that are on the filters are both random, right? I wanted to create that random squelchy kind of sound, but still maintained almost like an ARP melody to it, right? So semi-chaotic, but still quite tonal. I guess for me, that's kind of like a very full-on kind of style, is when it's very chaotic, but still very tonal, you know? Anyway, so you can see here, it's a pretty simple ARP pattern, just repeats, doing the root note, the 5th, and then the root note, and then the 3rd. Root note, 5th, sorry, 2nd, etc. And then, essentially, I just rendered that to an audio file. As you can see, this then becomes this audio file here. So these things I like to keep in groups. So for example, I should actually pop this vital into this group, right? Because it's that sound, right? And that's generally how I like to keep my projects neat. I broke my own rule in this instance. So here you'll see that I basically rendered the sound out and then just created a couple of variations here where I think this one just like filters out. Yeah, this has a filter on it. And then this has a delay on it. So it's like filters up to this transition, which delays out. And then here I use this interesting thing in Bitwig, which allows you to, I'm just going to kind of redo it here quickly. I'm going to copy this here. And so what we can do here is we can chop this audio file, right? And then say we want to repeat this 16 times, right? And we can also change the balance of the repeats. So this is cool for creating these kind of like build-ups that are slightly non-linear. So I did something like that where I chopped it, changed the linearity of the repeats, and then I gave it like a fade in like this, and that creates that like to the drop. And here's another thing. There's this kind of laser that happens here at the same time. So this, like where I placed it in the overall arrangement of the track, would actually happen here in the bar, right? Not here. And so, you know, as I was placing these things, I was like, you know what? Just in this part, it would be perfect if this just moved here. And it was less of like me thinking it would work, and me just playing with it and seeing like, does it work here? Doesn't it work here? So it's always a powerful thing to like take the thing and chop it and move it slightly, because often you'll get it to the point where it just like slots into place and it's like, haha, that's the drop, you know? So what am I trying to say here is by the overall grid of the arrangement, that sound shouldn't be here, but it just works. So it's there. Like you barely notice that it's in a different place to the rest of the grid, right? Like you don't notice that it's in a different like slot, you know, but it's still just, it works. Okay, so this sound started off as this sound, right? And I was like, okay, this is perfect, render this out, put this in the project as is. And then it remained in the project for very long as just that sound, right? But there was something that was kind of like about this whole part, which was just super rhythmical. It kind of just had this very driving rhythmical part after this part, which was kind of very chaotic and melodic. Do you know what I mean? So this flat lead just felt too legato, and it kind of always just stuck out for me. And I was for a long time like wondering what would be the solution for this, and it was actually so simple. So I just used Gatekeeper by Polyverse. I used the preset Pingo, and it just creates this kind of like very psytrance-y gated trance gate effect. I guess it's called the trance gate for a reason, eh? And that preset just like lined up, and it just felt so like in sync with the rest of the groove that was happening in that part. So it was like the perfect solution, and it was so simple, in fact. And I actually didn't do the full mix, so I wanted still maintain a little bit of the legato nature of the sound, just so we didn't lose too much of that pad and that atmospheric vibe. But I still wanted to just add a bunch of that rhythmic kind of texture. Let's listen in solo. Obviously with a delay as well. Okay, then we have the acid stab again, then the breakdown. So the breakdown's pretty simple. It's just a bunch of effects that I've kind of like thrown in there and played around with. I guess for me, the breakdown is less about, you know, what sound you're using and more about how it flows. You know what I mean? And the like how it then builds up to the next drop, you know? So for me, the sounds are more in like the overall arrangements and that kind of thing. But something that is interesting here that I did is I created this lead in Vital, which was like an ARP, right? And then it builds where it kind of like the audio chops over and over again there, right? So how I did that was basically taking that chopped lead sound and taking the kick sound and rendering them into one sample, right? Okay, that's down here. Going to just enable it, and we can solo this. So you'll see here, this is one sample loaded into a sampler with both that lead sound and that kick sound present. Then what I did is I set it into loop mode, and then just modulated the speed over here. So you can see the speed kind of like builds up to this point. So essentially what I was trying to do is create this rhythm that kind of like was chopping at the 16th and then slowly increased till it's like a riser. You know what I mean? So basically put it into a sampler, created that sound, and then I just bounced that entire sequence out, and that's what this is. I think then this is some variations of it. Yeah. I think this is just like a sound of that, like that sound with some filters on. I've actually used it a few times in the track, here in the beginning build as well. It's that same kick with the synth sound, with just like a bunch of filters and delays and stuff. And this, I think, is a kick with a reverb. Yeah. So like all together with a riser and everything kind of just like flows very nicely. And then this here was actually just that same build lead which I chopped for the thing, then just like played as a full sound. So often with build-ups, it's cool to kind of like reduce the sound or shorten the loop or something like that, and then repeat it over and over again, and then when the drops, you play the full thing. It's kind of like revealing the full hand at the drop. So that's a pretty cool technique as well. It kind of feels like you already know the sound when it comes in. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so the final main lead. This I kind of like, I guess, stumbled upon because I was just playing around with melodies on the keyboard over here. Just recording a bunch of stuff in because I knew like right at the end here, we really needed some kind of like huge melodic peak because the kind of track had like kind of circled around this idea between chaos and melody, and just before that kind of like build was kind of very chaotic because of the fact that like it kind of all sucked into that kind of crescendo, and so it just felt like here I really needed to kind of like do something big and melodic. So it took me a while to write this melody, even though it's kind of so simple, but the problem was that I always ended up putting too much in. I always ended up filling the gaps and that kind of thing. So it kind of, for me, it was more about like taking notes out. So I wrote a whole melody and ended up taking probably like 80% of the notes out, and then ended up with this. I think, again, the sound is pretty simple. Yeah, saw wave, 2 filters, and distortion with some other stuff. But that's like the basis of a lot of the main leads in Psytrance. Obviously, you get the FM, more complex kind of like sound designy type stuff. But the melodic leads are often based on a saw wave with a couple of filters, some distortion. They just become a lot more audible over the frequency range that way. The FM stuff tends to sound better at certain pitches and that kind of thing. So it's harder to do melodic stuff with the FM and vice versa. So anyway, awesome. I think that about covers most of the stuff that I wanted to talk about in this video. Let me know if you think there's anything that I maybe missed. If you want me to talk about like the kind of mastering type of stuff, maybe I'll do that in a separate episode because I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the same chain that I used on all of the tracks, just slightly tweaked. I can maybe go through a little bit about the gain staging because most of the time the settings remain very similar. I just kind of changed the gain in between a lot of the plugins. But yeah, if you want to know about that as well, let me know in the comments. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you haven't yet, go check out the album. Let me know what you think. And I'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. Cheers.